The air conditioning in the Superior Court of Fulton County hummed with a low mechanical drone that reminded me of a failing refrigerator compressor. It was a cold, sterile sound that matched the temperature of the room perfectly. I sat with my back straight and my hands folded on the mahogany table. I am Thomas Prescot. I am 70 years old. I have spent 50 years of my life on construction sites breathing in concrete dust and diesel fumes while building the skyline of Atlanta. I know how to spot a weak foundation from a mile away. But sitting there in that courtroom, I realized that the weakest foundation I ever built was my own marriage. To my right sat Cynthia. She is 48 years old, 22 years younger than me. When I met her, she was a filing clerk who told me she wanted to learn the business. I believed her. I taught her everything. I gave her the world. In return, she found Blake Harrington. I could see Blake sitting 2 rows behind her in the gallery. He was trying to look solemn, but he was failing miserably. He was covering his mouth with his hand to hide a smirk, but his eyes were dancing with greedy delight. He was wearing a charcoal gray Italian silk suit that fit him a little too tightly around the waist. I knew exactly how much that suit cost, because I had seen the charge on my American Express Platinum card 3 weeks ago. It cost $4,000. That was my money on his back. That was my sweat he was wearing. Cynthia leaned over toward me. Her expensive perfume, a scent of gardenias and money, wafted into my space. She brought her lips close to my ear so that only I could hear her. Her voice was a soft, venomous whisper. She said, "Today is the best day of my life, Tom, because I am finally going to take everything from you. You are going to die alone in the cheapest state-run nursing home I can find. I will not even visit your grave." She pulled back and smiled at the judge, a perfect mask of the grieving, soon-to-be ex-wife. I did not react. I did not flinch. I did not look at her with anger. I simply looked down at my watch. It was 10:45 in the morning. Next to me, my lawyer, Harland Fisk, shifted in his chair. Harland is 75 years old. He is a man who has practiced divorce law for so long that he has forgotten what human kindness looks like. He is a shark in a 3-piece suit. He leaned in close to me, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together in a cement mixer. He whispered, "Did you do exactly what I said, Tom? Did you confirm the liability waiver on page 42 is intact?" I nodded once, slowly. Harland smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who smells blood in the water. He whispered, "Good. The program starts right now." Judge Holloway cleared his throat. He was a tired-looking man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He shuffled through a stack of documents that represented 40 years of my hard work. He looked over his glasses at me with a gaze that held a trace of pity. I hated that look. I did not need his pity. I needed his signature. The judge began to read the final decree. Based on the prenuptial agreement being contested and voided due to the length of the marriage and the documented contributions of Mrs. Prescot to the business operations, this court rules as follows. Cynthia straightened her back. She looked like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. She was ready to feast. The court awards full ownership 100% of the shares and assets of Prescot Construction Incorporated to the plaintiff, Cynthia Prescot. This includes all heavy machinery, current contracts, brand trademarks, and the headquarters building in downtown Atlanta. I heard Blake let out a loud, sharp exhale of relief from the gallery behind us. I could picture him giving a thumbs up. They were looking at the revenue numbers. Prescot Construction brings in $15 million a year in gross revenue. They saw the cash flow. They saw the prestige. They saw the power of owning one of the biggest general contractors in the state. They did not see the steel cables holding the bridge up. They only saw the view from the top. The judge continued, his voice droning on. Furthermore, the court awards the marital residence located at Lake Lanier, including all furnishings, art collections, and the vehicle collection currently garaged there, to Mrs. Prescot. That house was my masterpiece. $5 million of custom architecture. I designed every truss. I calculated the wind load for every window. I hand-picked the timber for the framing. I built that house to stand for 100 years to shelter my family. Now she was going to turn it into a party house for her and her parasite boyfriend. Judge Holloway paused and looked at me again. Regarding the defendant, Thomas Prescot, the court awards the 1995 Ford F-150 pickup truck currently registered in his name, the personal retirement savings account ending in 402, and his personal effects including clothing and tools. That was it. That was the summary of my life. 40 years of building an empire, and I was walking away with a 25-year-old truck and a retirement account that had barely enough to rent a studio apartment for a few years. Cynthia turned to me fully now. She didn't bother whispering this time. She wanted me to hear it. She wanted Harland to hear it. She wanted the whole room to know she had won. She said, "Thank you for building my empire, Tom. Don't worry about the company. Blake is going to be the new CEO. He has a lot of modern ideas about digital marketing and expanding into luxury condos. He says your methods are dinosaurs, just like you. So do us a favor and disappear. Don't make us call security to remove you from the premises when we go to the office tomorrow to take possession." I looked at her. Really looked at her. I saw the greed in her eyes. It was a hunger that could never be satisfied. I looked past her to Blake, who was already texting furiously on his phone, probably ordering champagne or booking a first-class vacation to the Maldives with the company credit line. They were so arrogant. They were so sure that the gavel banging down was the end of the war. They did not know it was just the opening shot. I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. I am 70, but my back is straight. You do not haul lumber and climb scaffolding for decades without developing a spine of steel. I looked at the judge and nodded respectfully. Then I looked at the court clerk, who was sliding the final settlement papers across the table for signatures. This was the moment. This was the trapdoor. The document was 200 pages thick. Buried deep within the dense legalese in a section about asset transfer and operational continuity was a clause that Harland and I had drafted at 3 a.m. 3 weeks ago. It was a standard transfer of liability clause, but with very specific wording regarding the role of the qualifying agent. In the United States, specifically in the state of Georgia, a construction company is just a shell without a licensed qualifying agent. You cannot pull a permit, you cannot bid on a job, and you cannot legally hammer a nail without a general contractor license holder attached to the company. I was that agent. I was the only person in the entire company who held that license. The moment the ownership transferred fully, so did the requirement to maintain that license. But the license belongs to the individual, not the corporation. Cynthia grabbed the pen. She was eager. She was trembling with excitement. She didn't even read the summary page. She was signing her name with a flourish, the ink barely drying before she looked up at me with a triumphant sneer. She was signing for the assets. She thought she was signing for the bank accounts, the bulldozers, and the multi-million-dollar contracts. She did not realize she was also signing for the liabilities, the penalties, and the legal requirements to maintain a state general contractor license. She was signing a document that stated she accepted full legal and financial responsibility for every active project from this moment forward. Harland nudged my elbow gently. It was my turn to sign. My hand hovered over the paper. For a split second, I felt a pang of sadness. Not for the money. Not for the house, but for the legacy. Prescot Construction was my name. It was my father's name before me. Giving it to these vultures felt like tossing a diamond into a sewer. But I knew what was coming. I knew that in order to save the legacy, I had to let them steal the corpse. I signed my name, Thomas Edward Prescot. The signature was firm. No shakes. No hesitation. I put the pen down. The judge banged the gavel. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Case closed. The court is adjourned. Cynthia snatched the papers up, holding them to her chest like a winning lottery ticket. She laughed, a sound that was sharp and jagged. "It is done. It is finally mine." Blake walked up from the gallery area, ignoring court protocol, and put his hands on her shoulders, massaging her. He looked at me with a condescending grin and said, "Hey, Tom. No hard feelings, right? It is just business. I will take good care of your crew. I might have to fire the old lady Higgins, though. She is too slow. We need fresh blood." Mrs. Higgins was my secretary for 30 years. She knew where every skeleton was buried and where every penny was accounted for. Firing her would be the second worst mistake they ever made. The first was underestimating me. I packed my briefcase calmly. I put my old fountain pen back in my pocket. I turned to Harland and shook his hand. Harland gave me a barely perceptible nod. Then I turned to my ex-wife and her lover. I said one thing to them. Just one sentence. I said, "Good luck with the concrete." Cynthia rolled her eyes. "Go away, old man. Go drive your junk truck." I walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me with a solid thud. I walked down the marble hallway, my footsteps echoing. I felt light. I felt dangerous. I walked out into the bright Atlanta sunshine and saw my old Ford F-150 parked between a Mercedes and a BMW. It was dented. The paint was peeling. It had 200,000 miles on it. But the engine was sound. The foundation was good. I climbed into the truck and started the engine. It roared to life with a familiar rumble. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had one email drafted and ready to send. It was addressed to the State Licensing Board for General Contractors. The subject line read, "Immediate resignation and withdrawal of qualifying agent license for Prescot Construction." I hovered my finger over the send button. Back in the courtroom, Cynthia and Blake were probably hugging. They were probably planning which employees to fire and which cars to buy. They had no idea that at 12 noon tomorrow, exactly 24 hours from now, every single construction site under the Prescot name would be hit with a cease and desist order. They had no idea that by signing those papers, Cynthia had personally guaranteed the performance bonds on 5 major skyscrapers. I tapped the send button. The email whooshed away. The clock had started. They thought they took my life. They thought they stripped me bare. But they forgot one basic rule of construction. If you remove the load-bearing wall, the roof does not just leak. The whole house comes down. And I was going to enjoy watching it fall, to understand why I signed those divorce papers. With a smile, you have to go back 6 months to the night of my 70th birthday. I did not want a party. I wanted a quiet dinner with my wife. Maybe a good steak and a glass of bourbon on the deck overlooking the lake I had spent 10 years of my life paying for. But Cynthia insisted. She said she had a surprise. She said 70 was a milestone that needed to be celebrated. When I walked into the living room of the lake house I designed with my own hands, I realized the surprise was not for me. It was for her. The room was filled with 50 people I barely knew. They were her friends. They were young, loud, and ambitious. They drank my vintage wine straight from the bottle and treated me like a piece of antique furniture that had stayed in the room too long. Then I saw him. Blake. It was the first time I had ever laid eyes on the man who would eventually sleep in my bed. He was wearing a suit that was too tight and holding a crystal glass of my 1982 Cabernet, as if it were soda. Cynthia grabbed my arm and pulled me toward him. Her grip was tight, possessive, but not affectionate. She introduced him as her new financial advisor. Blake looked me up and down with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He said, "Happy birthday, Tom. 70 years is a long time. You must be exhausted. You know, in the digital age, businesses need young blood. Maybe it is time you sat on the porch and let the experts handle the heavy lifting." The guests around us chuckled. They looked at me with pity. They saw an old man in a cardigan who probably needed help operating the television remote. They did not see the man who could spot a structural fracture in a steel beam from 50 yards away. They did not know that while they saw a confused senior citizen, I was analyzing them like a blueprint. And I saw cracks everywhere. I felt suffocated. The noise was too loud. The perfume was too strong. I muttered an excuse about needing to take my heart medication and walked away. I did not need medication. I needed to get away from the smell of their expensive cologne and their cheap ambition. I walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The house was solid. I knew every stud in the walls. I knew where the plumbing ran. I knew which floorboards creaked. As I passed the master bathroom, I heard a voice. It was Cynthia. She was not whispering. She was confident. She thought the noise of the party drowned her out. She thought the old man was deaf. I stopped. I leaned against the wall next to the door, which was cracked open just an inch. She was on the phone. She sounded excited, almost breathless. She said, "Do not worry. The old fool is eating out of my hand. I have convinced him that his memory is slipping. He is scared. He thinks he is getting Alzheimer's just like his father. He trusts me completely." There was a pause while she listened to the person on the other end. Then she laughed. It was a cruel sound that I had never heard before. She continued speaking, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Yes, the power of attorney papers are ready. He will sign them tomorrow morning. Once I have that signature, we sell Prescot Construction. I already have a buyer lined up in China. They are offering $20 million for the brand and the equipment." My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the hallway. She went on. "Blake, we take the money and we run. We put Tom in that assisted living facility in Macon, the one with the state funding. He won't know the difference. And then we are free. We will have $20 million, and he will be out of the way for good." It wasn't just an affair. It was a demolition. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was planning to liquidate 40 years of my life and lock me away to rot while she spent my legacy. She was gaslighting me, making me doubt my own mind so she could steal my signature. I did not kick the door open. I did not scream. I did not confront her. An engineer does not act on emotion. An engineer assesses the damage, calculates the variables, and formulates a plan. If I confronted her now, she would deny it. She would say I was hallucinating. She would use my anger as proof of my senility. I walked silently down the hall to my private study. This was the only room in the house Cynthia hated because it smelled of old blueprints and dust. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The silence of the room wrapped around me like a shield. I walked over to the wall safe hidden behind the painting of the first skyscraper I ever built. My hands were steady. I spun the dial. Right to 14. Left to 28. Right to 5. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside there were deeds, cash, and jewelry. I ignored them all. I reached into the back of the safe and pulled out a single laminated document. It was old. The edges were worn. But the seal of the state of Georgia was still bright gold. It was my general contractor license, the qualifying agent certificate. Most people do not understand how the construction business works. They think the company is the asset. They think the trucks and the cranes and the office building are what matters. But in the state of Georgia, a construction company is just a shell without a licensed qualifying agent. Without this piece of paper, Prescot Construction could not bid on a job. It could not pull a permit. It could not legally hammer a nail. This license did not belong to the company. It belonged to me. It was attached to my name, my social security number, and my test scores from 40 years ago. I held it in my hands. I looked at my name printed on the front. Thomas Edward Prescott. Cynthia wanted the company. She wanted the $20 million. She thought she was holding the keys to the kingdom. She thought I was just a senile old man standing in her way. I stood in the dim light of my study and stared at that license. I realized then that I was not the victim. I was the one holding the detonator. She could have the company. She could have the name. She could have the bank accounts. But without this license, she was buying a car without an engine. I put the document back in the safe and locked it. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the painting. My eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a man who was about to bring the whole house down. I adjusted my cardigan. I unlocked the door and walked back out to the party. I smiled at my wife. I shook Blake's hand. I played the part of the tired old man. I let them believe they had won. But inside I had already started the countdown. The 3 months leading up to the divorce hearing were a masterclass in humiliation. It was a slow, systematic dismantling of my dignity designed to break whatever spirit I had left. Blake Harrington stopped hiding in the shadows. He started parking his leased Porsche right in the center of my driveway, blocking my truck. He walked into my house without knocking. He sat at the head of my dining table during dinner. He called himself my financial advisor, but he acted like the master of the manor waiting for the old lord to die. He would spread spreadsheets across the kitchen island covering up the plans for a hospital wing I was consulting on. He would tap the paper with a manicured fingernail and look at me with pity. He would say, "Tom, these margins are pathetic. You are running this company like it is 1995. You are still using paper invoices and handshake deals. It is embarrassing. The world is digital now. We need synergy. We need cloud-based integration. We need to cut the fat." I knew that Blake could not tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and a sheet of drywall. He threw around buzzwords he learned from business magazines to hide the fact that he was hollow inside. Synergy does not pour concrete. Cloud integration does not keep a 20-story crane from tipping over in a windstorm. But I did not correct him. I nodded slowly. I squinted at the papers as if I could not read the numbers. I let my hand shake when I reached for my coffee cup. I played the part of the confused old dinosaur perfectly. Then came the day Cynthia decided to cut the last lifeline I had to my sanity. It was a Tuesday morning. I was in my study reviewing the payroll. Mrs. Higgins, my secretary of 30 years, had sent over the files. She was the only person in the company who knew the truth about my health. She knew I was sharp. She knew I was playing a game. Cynthia walked in without knocking. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than my first car. She threw a folder onto my desk. She said, "Fire her." I looked up. "Who?" She sneered. "That old bat Higgins. She is dead weight. She is always asking questions. She looks at me like I am a criminal. And she smells like mothballs. Blake says we can replace her with an automated scheduling software and a part-time intern for a fraction of the cost. Get rid of her today." I felt a flash of real anger then. Mrs. Higgins had been with me since the days when the office was a trailer on a job site. She had sent flowers when my mother died. She remembered every employee's birthday. She was the heart of the office. But I knew that if Mrs. Higgins stayed, she would fight them. She would try to protect me. And in doing so, she would get hurt. She would be collateral damage in the war I was planning. It was better to send her to the lifeboats before the ship sank. I picked up the phone. My hand felt heavy. I called Mrs. Higgins. I told her that her services were no longer required. I heard her gasp on the other end. I heard the hurt in her silence. I wanted to tell her to wait. I wanted to tell her it was a trick, but I couldn't. Cynthia was watching me like a hawk. I hung up the phone and looked down at my hands. I looked defeated. Cynthia smiled. She walked over and patted me on the head like a dog. "Good boy, Tom," she said. "It is for the best. You will see." After that, I ramped up the performance. I started leaving the stove on. I would walk into a room and stand there looking around blankly, pretending I had forgotten why I was there. I called Blake by the wrong name. I called him Bill. I called him Bob. It drove him crazy, but it convinced them that my mind was going. They became careless. They stopped whispering. They started discussing the sale of the company right in front of me, assuming I could not follow the conversation. They talked about buying a penthouse in Miami. They talked about liquidating the equipment fleet. They were carving up the carcass of my life while I was still breathing. One rainy afternoon, they cornered me in the living room. Blake was sitting in my favorite leather armchair. Cynthia stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. On the coffee table, there was a thick stack of legal documents. Cynthia spoke first. Her voice was fake sweet, like syrup covering poison. She said, "Tom, we are worried about you. We have noticed you are slipping. You are forgetting things. You are confused. We think it might be early onset Alzheimer's." She paused for effect. I looked at her with wide, fearful eyes. I let my mouth hang open slightly. She continued, "We want to protect your legacy. We do not want people to remember Thomas Prescot as a senile old man who ran his company into the ground. If word gets out that you are sick, the banks will pull the loans. The clients will cancel contracts. You will be ruined." Blake leaned forward. He pushed the documents toward me. He said, "This is a generous settlement, Tom. You sign over full control of Prescott Construction to Cynthia. You give her the house. In exchange, we will not petition the court to have you declared mentally incompetent. We will keep your illness a secret. You can retire with your reputation intact. We will even let you keep your old truck so you can feel independent." It was blackmail. Pure and simple. They were threatening to destroy my name, to paint me as a madman unless I gave them everything I had built. I looked at the papers. I looked at the pen Blake was holding out to me. I took it. My hand trembled violently. I signed the last page. I did not read it. I did not argue. I just signed. Cynthia snatched the papers away the moment the ink hit the page. She looked at Blake and winked. She said, "You made the right choice, Tom. Now go get some rest. You look tired." I walked out of the room, shuffling my feet. I went to my bedroom and closed the door. I stood there in the dark for a long time. The trembling in my hands stopped. The confusion in my eyes vanished. I walked to the mirror and adjusted my collar. An hour later, I drove my truck to a nondescript office building in downtown Atlanta. The sign on the door said, "Harland Fisk, Attorney at Law." Harland was sitting behind a desk that looked like it had been carved out of a single piece of oak. The room smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. Harland is 75 years old, and he has eyes that have seen every kind of human betrayal imaginable. He does not trust anyone. That is why I pay him. I sat down and told him everything. I told him about the party. I told him about Mrs. Higgins. I told him about the blackmail and the papers I had just signed. Harland listened without blinking. He steepled his fingers and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He said, "Tom, you have two choices. We can fight this in court for the next 5 years. We can prove you are sane. We can expose their affair. We can battle for half the assets. You will keep your money. You will keep the house. But they will walk away with a settlement. They will be rich. They will laugh about how they almost got you." He paused and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. He slid it across the desk to me. Or he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "We can let them win. We can let them take the company. We can let them take the house. We can let them think they have stripped you bare. And then we can pull the pin on that grenade you have been holding." I took a sip of the scotch. It burned going down. It felt good. Harland leaned forward. The shadows in the room seemed to gather around him. He asked me a simple question. He said, "Tom, do you want to keep the money, or do you want to look them in the eye and watch them burn to ash?" I put the glass down. The sound of the crystal hitting the wood was sharp and final. I thought about Cynthia's fake smile, I thought about Blake sitting in my chair. I thought about Mrs. Higgins crying on the phone. I looked Harland dead in the eye. I did not hesitate. I said I want the ash. Harland and I spent the next 2 weeks constructing the most dangerous weapon I have ever built. It was not made of steel or concrete. It was made of paper. We turned his conference room into a war room. The table was covered in drafts, revisions, and red ink. We were not writing a divorce settlement. We were writing a death warrant disguised as a surrender. The final document was 200 pages thick. It was a dense brick of legal jargon specifically designed to make the eyes glaze over. We filled the first 50 pages with an exhaustive inventory of physical assets. We listed every excavator, every bulldozer, every pickup truck, and every computer monitor. We listed the serial numbers. We listed the depreciation values. We made it look like I was fighting tooth and nail to keep every single screw and bolt. This was the distraction. It was the magician waving his left hand while the right hand loaded the gun. While Cynthia and Blake were busy arguing over who got the 2018 Ford F-250 with the leather seats, they completely missed the landmine buried on page 142. It was a clause titled Assumption of Operational Liability and Continuity. To an untrained eye, it looked like standard boilerplate text. It stated that upon the finalization of the divorce decree, the transferee, which was Cynthia, would assume immediate and total responsibility for all active projects, including financial penalties, legal disputes, and performance bond guarantees. Harland sat across from me, his fountain pen tapping a rhythm on the oak desk. He looked over his glasses and said, "Listen to me closely, Tom. This is the kill shot. In the construction world, a performance bond is not just a piece of paper, it is a promise backed by cash. If a project is delayed, or if the contractor walks off the job, the insurance company pays the client, but then they come after the owner of the construction company for every single dime." He tapped the document hard. By signing this, Cynthia is personally guaranteeing every skyscraper, every hospital wing, and every parking deck currently under construction. If those jobs stop for even 1 day, the liquidated damages kick in. Do you know what the penalty is for the Midtown Tower project? I knew. I had negotiated the contract myself. I said it is $50,000 a day. Harland nodded grimly. $50,000 a day. And that is just one project. You have 5 active sites. If the work stops on all of them, she will be bleeding $250,000 every 24 hours. She does not have that kind of liquidity. No one does. She will bankrupt the company in a week. He pushed the stack of papers toward me. But this only works if she signs it without reading the fine print. She has to be so hungry for the assets that she swallows the poison along with the meal. I looked at the document. I knew Cynthia. I knew Blake. They were not builders. They were consumers. They looked at a balance sheet and saw only the revenue column. They ignored the expense column. They thought profit was magic. They did not understand that profit is what is left over after you survive the chaos. We presented the settlement offer 3 days later. We met in the office of Cynthia's lawyer, a man named David who wore too much cologne and had a diploma from a law school I had never heard of. Blake was there, of course. He sat next to Cynthia, reading the document over her shoulder, whispering in her ear like he was some kind of corporate genius. I watched them. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of defeat. I let my shoulders slump. I let my hand tremble when I reached for my water glass. I wanted them to see a broken man. I wanted them to think I was giving up because I was too weak to fight. Blake flipped through the pages quickly. He was looking for the numbers. He found the valuation section. His eyes widened. He pointed to the line that listed the total asset value at $22 million. He whispered something to Cynthia, and she smiled. It was a greedy, hungry smile. They did not read page 142. They did not ask about the performance bonds. They did not ask about the active liability insurance. They just saw the cars, the house, and the bank accounts. Cynthia looked up at me. She said, "Well, Tom, I must say I am surprised. This is actually reasonable. I expected you to drag this out. I expected you to be stubborn." I cleared my throat. I made my voice sound raspy and tired. I said, "I am tired, Cynthia. I just want it to be over. I want to go to the lake and fish. I do not have the energy to run this company anymore. You and Blake, maybe you are right. Maybe it is time for new blood." Blake puffed out his chest. He looked like a rooster who had just taken credit for the sunrise. He said, "Do not worry, Tom. We will take it to the next level. We are going to streamline operations. We are going to cut costs. We are going to maximize shareholder value." I almost laughed. Maximizing shareholder value in construction usually meant buying cheap concrete and hiring unskilled labor. It was a recipe for a lawsuit or a building collapse. But I nodded. I said, "Good luck." They signed the preliminary agreement right there. They were practically salivating. They thought they had just won the lottery. They did not know they had just pulled the pin on a grenade and put it in their pocket. The night before the final court hearing, I was alone in the lake house. The party guests were gone. Cynthia was staying at a hotel with Blake, ostensibly to give me space to pack, but really to celebrate their victory without having to look at my face. The house was quiet. I walked through the rooms one last time. I touched the walls I had framed. I looked out at the water through the windows I had installed. I was saying goodbye. Not with sadness, but with a cold sense of finality. This house was no longer a home. It was just an asset. And tomorrow it would be a prison for my ex-wife. I went to my study and sat down at my desk. It was 2 a.m. The world outside was dark and still. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the darkness, illuminating the lines on my face. I opened my email client. I had a draft saved. I had written it weeks ago, but I had never entered the recipient's address. Now I typed it in. It was the direct email address for the director of the Georgia State Licensing Board for General Contractors. The subject line was simple: immediate resignation and withdrawal of qualifying. Agent license. I began to type the body of the email. My fingers moved steadily over the keys. To the licensing board. Please accept this formal notification that effective immediately upon the conclusion of court proceedings tomorrow at 12 noon, I am resigning from my position as the qualifying agent for Prescot Construction, Inc. I am disassociating my general contractor license number G from this entity. I am no longer responsible for the supervision, direction, or control of construction activities performed by this company. Please be advised that as of tomorrow afternoon, Prescot Construction will no longer have a licensed individual in a qualifying capacity. I read it over. It was clinical. It was precise. It was devastating. In the state of Georgia, you cannot operate a construction company without a qualifying agent. The moment this resignation was processed, the company's license number would become invalid. Every permit pulled under that number would be suspended. Every inspection would be halted. Every job site would be legally required to shut down immediately. It takes at least 30 days to qualify a new agent. You have to pass a background check. You have to pass a rigorous exam that takes months to study for. You have to prove financial solvency. Blake could not pass that exam if you gave him the answer key. Cynthia couldn't tell a joist from a jam. They would be dead in the water for a month. And in that month, the penalties would eat them alive. I looked at the clock. It was 2:14 in the morning. The court hearing was in 8 hours. I thought about the way Blake had looked at me. I thought about Cynthia whispering in the bathroom about putting me in a home. I thought about Miss Higgins crying when I fired her to save her. I did not feel guilty. I felt like a demolition expert pressing the button to bring down a condemned building. It had to be done to clear the way for something new. I moved the cursor over the send button. My hand did not shake. My heart rate did not increase. I was calm. I was ready. I clicked send. The email vanished from my screen. It was done. The fuse was lit. The countdown had begun. In exactly 48 hours, the state inspectors would receive this notification. They would print out the cease and desist orders. They would get in their cars, and the nightmare would begin. I closed the laptop. I stood up and turned off the light. I walked out of the study and went to the guest bedroom to sleep for a few hours. I needed my rest. Tomorrow was going to be a very big day. I drove my truck back to the lake house for the last time, not to sleep, but to collect the few things the court had allowed me to keep. I parked next to Blake's Porsche, which was straddling two spaces like a monument to his ego. I walked past it without touching it. I did not key the paint. I did not slash the tires. Petty vandalism is for amateurs. I had already planted a nuclear device in the heart of their operation. I just needed to get out of the blast radius. Inside the house was quiet. I packed my clothes into 3 cardboard boxes. I took my father's old hammer, which hung in a shadow box in the den. I took the photo of my mother from the mantel. I left the furniture. I left the art. I left the 60-inch television. I carried the boxes out to the truck bed and covered them with a tarp. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked at the house one last time. It was a beautiful structure. Massive timber beams, stone accents, floor-to-ceiling glass. It was worth $5 million. But looking at it then, it felt like looking at a mausoleum. It was cold. It was empty. It was theirs. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled away. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove straight to a small motel on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was clean and cheap. It would do for a few nights until the dust settled. While I was checking into my room, Cynthia and Blake were making their grand entrance at the headquarters of Prescot Construction in downtown Atlanta. I know this because Mrs. Higgins called me later that night in tears to tell me what happened. Even though I had fired her to protect her, she still had friends in the building. She told me they walked into the lobby like royalty. Cynthia was wearing a white suit and carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon. Blake was right behind her, high-fiving the security guard, who looked at him with confusion. They took the elevator straight to the top floor, to the executive suite. My suite. They walked into my office. It was a corner office with a view of 3 skyscrapers I had built. Blake walked behind my desk, the heavy oak desk that had belonged to my mentor, and sat down in my leather chair. He put his feet up on the wood. He popped the cork on the champagne and let it spray over the carpet. They toasted to the new era. They toasted to the death of the old guard. An hour later, they called an emergency all-hands meeting in the main conference room. Every project manager, every lead engineer, and every site superintendent was there. These were men and women who had been with me for decades. They were serious professionals. They built hospitals and bridges. They did not have time for games. Blake stood at the head of the table. He did not introduce himself. He just assumed they knew who he was. He started his speech. He told them that Prescot Construction had been underperforming. He said that under my leadership the company had become bloated and inefficient. He used words like optimization and lean dynamics. Then he started giving orders. He pulled up a spreadsheet on the projector. It showed the material costs for the Midtown Tower project, a 40-story luxury condo building that was currently on the 12th floor of construction. He pointed to the line item for structural steel and concrete. He said these numbers are too high. We are bleeding money on materials. From now on, we switch suppliers. I found a vendor overseas who can provide steel rebar for 30% less than our current domestic supplier. Cancel the current contracts and switch to the new vendor immediately. The room went silent. Mike Donovan, my chief engineer, stood up. Mike is a big man with hands like shovels. He has been building high-rises since Blake was in diapers. He said, "Excuse me, Mr. Harrington, but we cannot do that. The specs for the Midtown Tower require domestic steel with a specific tensile strength rating. If we switch to cheap imported rebar, we compromise the structural integrity of the building. It violates the building code, and it violates our contract with the developers." Blake laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "Listen to me, Mike. Steel is steel. It is all the same metal. The only difference is the brand name. You engineers are always over-engineering everything to cover your backs. I am telling you to switch the vendor. We need to get those margins up. If you are too scared to do it, I will find someone who is not." Mike turned red. He looked at Cynthia, hoping for some sanity. Cynthia was checking her reflection in her phone screen. She didn't care about tensile strength. She only cared about the profit margin. Blake wasn't done. He moved to the next slide. It was the labor schedule. He said, "I have been looking at the overtime payouts. We are spending a fortune on overtime. That stops today. From now on, the crews work until the daily quota is met. If they can't finish in 8 hours, they stay until it is done. But we are capping paid overtime. If they are slow, that is their problem, not ours. We need to motivate them to work faster." The silence in the room changed from shock to anger. In the construction industry, you do not mess with the crew's pay. These men and women work in the scorching heat and the freezing rain. They risk their lives hanging off steel beams 500 feet in the air. You pay them for every second they are on the clock. If you try to cheat them, they walk. Or worse, they get careless. And when people get careless on a construction site, people die. Mike spoke again. His voice was low and dangerous. He said, "You want us to tell the unions that we are mandating unpaid overtime. You want us to tell the crews to work faster with cheaper materials. Do you have any idea what you are doing? You are going to get us shut down. You are going to get someone killed." Blake slammed his hand on the table. He stood up, his face flushing. He said, "I am the CEO now. I give the orders. You are just employees. You do what I say, or you can pack your boxes. I am tired of this old way of thinking. This is a business, not a charity." Mike looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Cynthia, who was sipping her champagne. Then he took off his hard hat. He placed it gently on the conference table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID badge. He dropped it next to the hat. He said, "I built this company with Tom Prescot. We built it on quality and respect. I am not going to be the one who tears it down. I am not going to put my name on a building that might collapse because you wanted to save a few dollars on rebar. I quit." He turned and walked out. For a second, nobody moved. Then the dam broke. Sarah, the head of logistics, stood up and put her badge on the table. Then David, the senior architect. Then the 3 site superintendents for our biggest projects. One by one, the brain trust of Prescott Construction, the people who actually knew how to build things, walked out of the room. Blake watched them go with a sneer. He yelled after them, "Go ahead and leave. You are all dinosaurs anyway. You are overpaid and entitled. I can hire fresh graduates from Georgia Tech tomorrow for half your salary. They will be hungry. They will listen to me." Cynthia looked a little worried now. She asked Blake, "Are you sure about this?" Those were the project leads. Blake waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry, baby. They are bluffing. They will be back begging for their jobs in a week. And if they don't, we will replace them. Construction isn't rocket science. You pour concrete, you put up steel. Any idiot can manage it." They spent the rest of the afternoon celebrating. They ordered expensive catering. They talked about redecorating the office. They sent emails to the remaining junior staff announcing the new leadership and the new cost-saving measures. They felt powerful. They felt invincible. They went home to my lake house that night and slept in my bed. They probably slept soundly, dreaming of the millions they were going to make. They did not know that the email I sent at 2 in the morning had been opened. They did not know that a clerk at the state licensing board had read my resignation and flagged it as urgent. They did not know that the database had been updated. The next morning broke clear and cool over Atlanta. It was 8 o'clock on a Wednesday. The city was waking up. Traffic was humming on the connector. At the Midtown Tower site, the cranes were idle because the lead crane operator had walked out with Mike the day before. The junior crew was standing around, confused, waiting for orders that weren't coming. At the hospital expansion site, the concrete trucks were lined up, but the foreman refused to pour because he hadn't received the authorization from the project manager, who had also quit. And at the new stadium parking deck project, the crew was sitting on their coolers drinking coffee, wondering why the gates were locked. Then they saw them. A convoy of 4 black SUVs with the state seal on the doors turned the corner. They moved with purpose. They pulled up to the curb in front of the Midtown Tower site. The doors opened, and a team of men and women in windbreakers stepped out. They were not smiling. They carried clipboards and rolls of red tape. They were the enforcement division of the state licensing board, and they were not there for a routine inspection. The lead inspector, a man named Agent Miller, walked up to the construction fence. He took a large roll of red tape from his bag. He pulled out a staple gun. He walked to the main gate. He slapped a bright orange poster against the plywood. Bam, bam, bam. The sound of the staples echoed like gunshots. The poster read in massive black letters, "Stop work order." Below that, in smaller text, it cited the violation. Operation of a general contracting entity without a valid qualifying agent. Violation of Georgia Code, Title 43. Immediate cessation of all activities required by law. Agent Miller turned to the confused workers. He shouted, "Listen up. This site is now closed. Prescot Construction currently holds no valid license to operate in the state of Georgia. Everyone needs to clear the site immediately. If you pick up a tool, you will be fined. If you start a machine, you will be arrested. Go home." At the same moment across town at the hospital site and the stadium site, the same scene was playing out. Red tape, orange signs, police cruisers pulling up to enforce the order. In my motel room, I was sitting on the edge of the bed drinking a cup of bad coffee. I watched the local news. The reporter was standing in front of the Midtown Tower. The headline on the screen read, "Construction Giant Halted State Shutters Prescott Projects." I took a sip of coffee. It tasted better than the finest champagne. The takeover was over. The nightmare had just begun. The sound of a staple gun firing into plywood is distinct. It is a sharp, metallic crack that echoes against the steel beams of a skyscraper. At 8:15 in the morning, that sound replaced the roar of diesel engines and the hum of power tools at the Midtown Tower site. Agent Miller moved with the efficiency of an executioner. He walked from one gate to the next, smoothing down the bright orange posters that screamed, "Stop work, order," in bold black letters. The site superintendent, a man named Jerry, who I had hired 10 years ago, ran up to the fence. He was sweating despite the morning chill. He was shouting through the chain link, asking what the hell was going on. He waved the permits in the air. He said, "We have permits. We have inspections scheduled for tomorrow. You cannot just shut us down." Agent Miller did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the poster. He said those permits were issued under the license of Thomas Prescot. As of 2 o'clock this morning, Thomas Prescot is no longer the qualifying agent for this company. Without a qualifying agent, these permits are just expensive wallpaper. By law, this site is now an active crime scene if anyone picks up a hammer. Jerry looked like he had been punched in the gut. He dropped his hands. He knew the law. He knew that without that license number attached to the project, the insurance was void, the bonds were invalid, and the entire operation was illegal. He turned to his crew, who were watching with fearful eyes, and drew a finger across his throat. "Kill it. Kill it all." The silence that followed was terrifying. A construction site is a living, breathing beast. It vibrates with energy. When you kill the power, it feels like a heart stopping. The cranes froze in the sky. The cement mixers stopped churning. 500 workers stood still, waiting for answers that Jerry did not have. Across town at the new hospital wing, the scene was even more chaotic. The police had arrived to enforce the order. They were escorting the subcontractors off the property. A foreman was arguing with an officer, pointing at a half-poured concrete slab that was rapidly curing. He yelled that if they didn't finish the pour, the concrete would set unevenly, and they would have to jackhammer it all out. The officer did not care about the concrete. He cared about the code. He told the foreman to step away from the vehicle, or he would be arrested for operating without a license. At the Prescot construction headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to panic in the span of 10 minutes. Cynthia was sitting in my office drinking a latte and looking at fabric swatches for the new curtains. Blake was on the phone with a Porsche dealership ordering a custom color for his new car. Then the phone on Mrs. Higgins' old desk started ringing. The receptionist who replaced her, a young girl named Ashley, picked it up. She listened for a moment, her face turning pale. Then the other line rang. Then the cell phone of the project manager in the next office started buzzing. Within minutes, the reception area sounded like a call center during a disaster. It was the site superintendents. All of them. Ashley ran into my office. She didn't knock. She was trembling. She said, "Ms. Prescot, Mr. Harrington, you need to take these calls. It is Jerry from Midtown. It is Sarah from the hospital. They say the state is there. They say the police are shutting them down." Cynthia dropped the fabric swatch. She looked at Blake. She said, "What does she mean, shutting them down? We own the company. We have the contracts." Blake stood up, adjusting his tie. He tried to look authoritative, but I imagine he looked more like a captain who just realized he didn't know how to swim. He grabbed the phone. He shouted into the receiver. "Who is this? Jerry? What are you talking about? Tell them to leave. Tell them I am the CEO and I order them to let you work." I can only imagine what Jerry said to him, but Blake's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. He pulled the phone away from his ear as if it had bitten him. He looked at Cynthia. He said, "They are saying something about a license. They say we don't have a qualifying agent." Cynthia frowned. She said, "What is a qualifying agent? We are the owners. That qualifies us." Blake didn't know. He had never bothered to learn the regulations. He thought owning a construction company was about signing checks and wearing hard hats for photo opportunities. He didn't know that the qualifying agent was the legal anchor for the entire entity. Cynthia grabbed her purse. She was starting to panic. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she had been dreading. She dialed me. I was sitting in a folding chair on the bank of Lake Lanier, about 5 miles down from my old house. The water was calm like glass. I had a fishing line in the water, but there was no bait on the hook. I wasn't there to catch fish. I was there to catch the sound of my phone ringing. It rang. I let it go to voicemail once. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted her to imagine the silence of the job sites. I wanted her to hear the sound of money burning. It rang again. I picked it up slowly. I put it on speakerphone and set it on the cooler beside me. I cast my line out a little further. I said, "Hello, Cynthia. How is the first day of the new empire going?" Her voice was a shriek. It was so loud, it scared a duck that was paddling nearby. She screamed, "Tom, what have you done? What did you do to my company? The police are at the job sites. They are sending everyone home." They pasted red signs on the gates. I reeled in the line a few inches. I spoke calmly, my voice blending with the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. I said, "I haven't done anything to your company, Cynthia. I simply resigned. You wanted me gone, remember? You told me to disappear. You told me I was a dinosaur." She was hyperventilating. I could hear Blake shouting in the background, telling her to threaten me. She said, "But you can't just stop the work. We have contracts. We have deadlines. Why are they saying we don't have a license?" I sighed. It was a long, patient sigh, the kind you give a child who refuses to understand why they cannot touch the stove. I said, "Cynthia, in the state of Georgia, the general contractor license is issued to an individual, not a corporation. I was the individual. I passed the exams. I passed the board review. I held the liability. When I left the company, the license left with me. It is in my pocket right now." There was a silence on the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. Then she whispered, her voice trembling with the first real fear she had felt in months. "So what does that mean?" I said, "It means you are currently operating an illegal construction business. It means every day those sites are closed, you are in breach of contract. It means the liquidated damages clauses in the contracts you signed yesterday are about to kick in." I paused to let that sink in. I wanted her to do the math. I continued. "If I recall correctly, the penalty for the Midtown Tower is $50,000 a day. The hospital is $30,000. The stadium deck is $20,000. That is $100,000 a day, Cynthia. Every single day until you find a new qualifying agent." She screamed. "But that will take weeks. We can't find someone in a day. We have to vet them. They have to apply to the state." I said, "Actually, it takes about 30 to 60 days if you fast-track it. And that is assuming you can find someone with an unlimited tier license who is willing to attach their name to a company that is currently under investigation by the state licensing board. Which you are as of this morning." She started to cry. It wasn't a sad cry. It was the angry, desperate cry of someone who realizes they have walked into a trap. She said, "You have to come back. You have to fix this. You can't let this happen. We will lose everything." I looked out at the lake. The sun was shining on the water. It was a beautiful day. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in 40 years. I said, "I can't come back, Cynthia. I am retired. I am just an old man with a fishing pole and a truck. I am not cut out for the modern digital business world. Besides, I wouldn't want to get in Blake's way. He has so much synergy to implement." Blake's voice came onto the line. He sounded desperate. He said, "Look, Tom, we can work something out. We can pay you a consulting fee. We can rent your license. Just come sign the papers to reactivate the sites." I laughed. It was a dry, dusty laugh. I said, "Blake, renting a license is illegal. It is called license lending, and it is a felony. I am surprised a financial genius like you didn't know that." I reached for the button to end the call. I said, "Listen, I have a fish on the line. I have to go. Good luck finding a new qualifying agent. You have about 24 hours before the developers invoke the performance bonds and the insurance companies come looking for your personal assets. I hope you enjoy the house while you still have it." I hung up the phone. I didn't actually have a fish. I just reeled in the empty hook. I baited it with a worm and cast it out again. I sat there for a long time watching the bobber float on the water, listening to the birds, and thinking about the chaos unfolding 5 miles away. The concrete was hardening in the trucks. The schedules were crumbling. The empire was falling. And the best part was I didn't have to push a single wall. Gravity was doing all the work. The silence in the lake house must have been deafening after I hung up the phone. I imagined Cynthia staring at the screen, her hands shaking the reality of her situation, finally crashing down on her like a ton of bricks. But panic is a powerful motivator. For the next 24 hours, she and Blake tried to dig themselves out of the hole I had dug for them. They failed miserably, because you cannot dig your way out of a grave. You just make it deeper. They started making calls. Blake was convinced that a qualifying agent was just a commodity, something you could buy off the shelf like a bag of cement. He called every headhunter in Atlanta. He called retired contractors. He even called a few of my old competitors thinking he could poach their license holders with promises of exorbitant salaries. What Blake did not understand is that the construction industry is a small world. Word travels faster than light. By noon that Wednesday, everyone in the state knew that Prescot Construction was under active investigation by the licensing board. They knew the sites were shut down. They knew the police were involved. Attaching your license to a company is not a small thing. You are putting your professional life on the line. If the company violates code, you lose your license. If the company gets sued, you get sued. No sane qualifying agent with an unlimited tier license would touch a company that had just been red-tagged by the state. It would be professional suicide. They were radioactive. By Thursday morning, the financial dominoes began to fall. The first one was the liquidated damages. I had negotiated the contracts for the Midtown Tower, the hospital expansion, and the stadium deck myself. I knew the clauses by heart. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the legal counsel for the Midtown Tower developers sent a formal notice of breach. Because the site was inactive, the delivery date was now in jeopardy. The contract stipulated a penalty of $50,000 for every day of delay. An hour later, the hospital board sent their notice. $30,000 a day. By lunch, the stadium developers chimed in. $20,000 a day. That was $100,000 a day in penalties, cash, payable immediately upon demand or deducted from the retention funds. Cynthia and Blake were bleeding $4,000 an hour, and they hadn't even unlocked the office doors yet. They sat in my office staring at the notices. Cynthia was pale. She asked Blake where they were going to get the money. Blake told her to relax. He told her to look at the operating account. He pulled up the banking app on the computer. He pointed to the balance. There was $5 million in the main operating account. See, Blake said, we have plenty of cash. We can pay the penalties for weeks while we fix this license mess. We are rich, baby. Don't worry. That was the moment they made the mistake that would turn a bankruptcy into a felony. That $5 million was not profit. It was not their money. It was a mobilization advance from the hospital project. It was money specifically designated for purchasing specialized medical-grade HVAC units and copper piping. In the construction industry, that money is held in trust. You cannot spend it on anything other than the project. Using it for operating expenses or penalties is a breach of fiduciary duty. Using it for personal expenses is embezzlement. But Blake didn't know that. And Cynthia didn't care. She saw the number with 6 zeros and she felt safe. She told Blake to transfer $500,000 to the luxury car dealership to pay off the balance on the custom Porsche he had ordered. She wanted to cheer him up. She wanted to prove they were still in control. Blake made the transfer. He clicked the button. The screen processed for a moment. Then a message popped up in red text. Transaction denied. Account frozen. Contact institution immediately. They tried again. Denied. They tried the payroll account. Denied. They tried the corporate credit cards. Declined. The second domino had fallen. Construction lending is based on risk assessment. When the state inspectors shut down the job sites, they filed a report. That report went into a public database. The risk algorithms at the First National Bank of Georgia picked up the alert instantly. A construction company that cannot build has no income. A company with no income cannot service its debt. The bank did exactly what any bank would do. They panicked. They froze the line of credit to stop the bleeding. They locked down the operating accounts to secure their collateral. Cynthia grabbed the desk phone and dialed the bank manager. She screamed at him. She demanded to know why her money was hostage. The manager was polite but cold. He informed her that under the terms of the commercial loan agreement, the issuance of a stop work order constituted a material default. The bank was exercising its right to offset. They were freezing all assets until a risk audit could be completed. Then he dropped the bomb. He asked about the attempted transfer of $500,000 to a car dealership. He asked why project funds were being moved to a non-vendor entity. He used the word audit. He used the word fraud. Cynthia dropped the phone. She looked at Blake. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue. She whispered, "They know about the car. They know we tried to use the hospital money." Blake was pacing the room, sweating through his expensive shirt. He said, "It is a mistake. I will fix it. I will call my lawyer." But he didn't have a lawyer. He had a drinking buddy who passed the bar exam 20 years ago. Cynthia sat in my leather chair, the chair she had fought so hard to take from me, and realized she was trapped. She had $5 million in the bank that she couldn't touch. She had penalties racking up at a rate of $100,000 a day. And she had just left a digital footprint attempting to steal client funds to buy a sports car. She wasn't just broke. She was a criminal. I was sitting in my new apartment unpacking my boxes when my phone buzzed. It was a news alert. The local business journal had picked up the story. Major Atlanta contractor halted. Assets frozen amidst licensing scandal. I read the article calmly. It mentioned the stop work orders. It mentioned the bank freeze. It mentioned rumors of financial mismanagement. It did not mention me. I was a ghost. I was the invisible hand that had tipped the first domino. But the final blow came late that afternoon. A courier arrived at the Prescot construction headquarters. He walked past the weeping receptionist who hadn't been paid and took the elevator to the executive suite. He handed a thick envelope to Cynthia. It was a lawsuit. But it wasn't from the bank. It wasn't from the state. It was from the Sovereign Group, the developers behind the Midtown Tower. They were known for being ruthless. They did not play games. The lawsuit cited breach of contract negligence and fraud. It named Prescot Construction as a defendant. But it also named Cynthia Prescot personally, because of the clause on page 142, the clause she signed without reading, the clause where she accepted full personal liability for all operational risks. The Sovereign Group was not asking for the $50,000 a day penalty. They were exercising the nuclear option. They were canceling the contract entirely due to gross incompetence and illegal operation. They were demanding the return of all progress payments. They were suing for damages to their reputation. The total amount demanded in the suit was $10 million. Cynthia read the number. She looked at the zeros. She looked at Blake, who was cowering in the corner trying to delete emails from his phone. She realized then that the house, the cars, the jewelry, and the bank accounts were gone. $10 million was more than everything she had stolen from me. She screamed. It was a primal sound of pure terror. She threw the papers at Blake. She swept the lamp off the desk. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. I imagined the sun was setting over the city just like it was outside my window. The golden light hitting the steel skeleton of the Midtown Tower, the tower that would never be finished by Prescot Construction. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood on my balcony and looked out at the skyline. I felt a strange sense of balance. The scales were tipping. The weight of their greed was dragging them down into the abyss, and the man they called a dinosaur was the only one left standing on solid ground. The week that followed the filing of the lawsuit was a study in disintegration. The pressure inside the lake house must have been physical, like the air inside a submarine that has gone too deep. Outside, the pressure was literal. By Friday morning, a crowd had gathered at the heavy iron gates of the estate. It was not the media. It was the workers. The crew from the stadium project, who had been sent home without their weekly paychecks, had found out where the new owner lived. They stood on the public road, holding cardboard signs and chanting. They wanted their money. They wanted answers. Cynthia was trapped inside her $5 million fortress. She closed the heavy velvet drapes I had installed to block out the morning sun. She paced the travertine floors, her phone in her hand, calling lawyers who would not answer, and bankers who had blocked her number. She was watching her life evaporate 1 hour at a time. But while Cynthia was looking out the window at the angry mob, Blake Harrington was looking at the exit signs. Blake is a rat. I have known men like him my whole life. They are the ones who wear the cleanest vests on the job site, but disappear the moment a storm rolls in. He realized before Cynthia did that the ship was not just taking on water. It was already at the bottom of the ocean. He knew that the lawsuit from the Sovereign Group was just the first wave. The IRS would be next. Then the Department of Labor. He realized that if he stayed, he would be named in the civil suits. He would be deposed. He would be ruined. But if he left now, if he vanished while the chaos was focused on Cynthia, he might just survive. He spent Friday afternoon in the guest bedroom, which he had converted into his home office. He told Cynthia he was working on a strategy to liquidate some heavy machinery to pay the workers. He told her he was negotiating a bridge loan with a private equity firm in New York. He was lying. He was on his laptop logging into Cynthia's personal accounts. The business accounts were frozen solid by the bank, but Cynthia's personal savings, the money she had inherited from her grandmother, and the alimony payments she had preemptively transferred from our joint account, were still accessible. It was about $200,000. Not a fortune, but enough to start over in a place where nobody knew his name. I can imagine his fingers flying across the keyboard. He didn't hesitate. He didn't feel guilty. To him, Cynthia was just another failed investment. He initiated a wire transfer to an offshore account in the Caymans, a shell account he probably set up years ago for situations exactly like this. He pressed enter. The screen flashed. Transaction complete. He closed the laptop. He stood up and walked to the closet. He pulled out 2 large Louis Vuitton duffel bags. He didn't pack his clothes. He packed the things that had value. He opened Cynthia's jewelry box. He took the diamond tennis bracelet I gave her for our 20th anniversary. He took the sapphire earrings. He took the Rolex watches she had bought for him with company money. He swept them all into the bag. Then he went to the wall safe in the master bedroom. He knew the combination because Cynthia trusted him more than she trusted herself. He opened it and took out the emergency cash stack, about $10,000, that I always kept there for hurricanes or power outages. He zipped up the bags. He was ready. He walked down the grand staircase, the heels of his Italian shoes clicking on the marble steps. He looked around the foyer. He wasn't saying goodbye. He was checking to make sure the coast was clear. But the coast was not clear. Cynthia was coming out of the kitchen holding a glass of wine. It was 2 in the afternoon, but time had lost its meaning in that house. She saw him. She saw the bags. She saw the way he was dressed in his traveling coat, looking like a man running for a train. She stopped. The glass shook in her hand. She asked him where he was going. She asked him why he had the bags. Blake didn't lie this time. He didn't have the energy. He looked at her with a cold, dead stare. He said, "I am leaving, Cynthia. This is over. You are toxic. You are going to drag me down with you, and I am not going to let that happen." Cynthia dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, spraying red wine across the white stone like blood. She ran to him. She grabbed his arm. She screamed that they were partners. She screamed that he promised to fix this. She begged him not to leave her alone with the lawyers and the angry workers outside. Blake laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. He pushed her off him. He told her that she was a fool. He told her that she never owned the company, she just stole it. He said she was incompetent, and that he had only stuck around this long because he thought there would be a payout. But now the money was gone and she was nothing but a liability. He turned toward the front door. Cynthia screamed. She lunged at him, clawing at the bag, trying to stop him. She wasn't fighting for the jewelry. She was fighting for her dignity. She was fighting against the realization that she had destroyed her family for a man who saw her as an ATM machine. Blake spun around. He shoved her hard. He didn't hold back. Cynthia flew backward. She tripped over her own feet and fell hard onto the marble floor. Her head hit the bottom step of the staircase with a sickening thud. She lay there, stunned, gasping for air. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. She watched the man she loved, the man she chose over me, adjust his coat and turn his back on her. He walked out the front door. He walked past the angry workers who were shouting at the gate. They didn't stop him because they didn't know who he was. They thought he was a lawyer or an agent. He walked to the garage. He bypassed his Porsche. He didn't want a car that was leased in his name. He wanted something faster, something that could get him to the state line in style. He walked to the azure blue Bentley Continental GT. It was the crown jewel of the vehicle collection. It was a $200,000 car. The keys were in the ignition. We always left them there inside the secure garage. He opened the door and slid into the cream leather seat. He started the engine. The twin-turbo W12 roared to life. He hit the garage door opener. As the door rose, he saw the open road. He saw freedom. He peeled out of the garage, swerving around the protesters at the gate, leaving skid marks on the driveway. He accelerated down the long, winding road that led away from the lake. He was doing 80 miles an hour before he hit the main highway. He thought he had escaped. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. He thought he had won. But Blake made one critical error. He forgot about the paperwork. When the court awarded the vehicle collection to Cynthia, the judge signed the order. But a court order does not magically change the registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles. You have to file the title transfer. You have to pay the ad valorem tax. You have to process the paperwork. Usually Mrs. Higgins handled the vehicle registrations. She was the one who made sure every tag was renewed and every title was clean. But Cynthia had fired Mrs. Higgins before the divorce was final. And in the chaos of the takeover and the champagne toasts and the arrogance, no one had bothered to go to the tag office. Legally, on the state database, that Bentley still belonged to me, Thomas Prescot. I was sitting in my apartment eating a sandwich when my phone alerted me. It was the GPS tracker app connected to the fleet insurance policy. I had never removed the app from my phone because technically, until the titles were transferred, I was still the policyholder. I saw the dot representing the Bentley moving. It was moving fast. It was heading north on Interstate 85 toward the South Carolina border. I knew Cynthia wasn't driving. She was terrified of that car. She said it was too powerful. I knew exactly who was behind the wheel. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. I kept my voice calm. I told the dispatcher that I wanted to report a grand theft auto in progress. I gave them my name. I gave them the description of the vehicle. I told them that an unauthorized individual, a former employee named Blake Harrington, had taken the vehicle without my permission and was driving recklessly northbound on I-85. The dispatcher asked if I was the registered owner. I said yes. She checked the database. It confirmed my name. She said units are being dispatched immediately, Mr. Prescott. I hung up the phone. I pulled up the traffic camera feed on my laptop. I have access to the DOT cameras because of my work with the city infrastructure. I found the camera at mile marker 106. 10 minutes later, I saw it. The blue Bentley flashed across the screen, weaving through traffic, cutting off a semi-truck. And right behind it were 3 Georgia State Patrol Chargers, their blue lights flashing in unison. Blake saw them in his rearview mirror. I imagined the panic that seized his throat. He probably thought about running. He probably thought about pushing that 12-cylinder engine to the limit. But even a Bentley cannot outrun a radio. He pulled over. He stopped on the shoulder of the highway. I watched on the grainy camera feed as the troopers approached the car with their guns drawn. They pulled him out. They threw him onto the asphalt. They cuffed his hands behind his back. They opened the trunk. They found the duffel bags. They found the jewelry. They found the cash. They ran his ID. They found the outstanding warrant for embezzlement that I hadn't even known about from a previous job in Florida, but which popped up the moment they ran his name through the National Crime Database. Blake Harrington was arrested for grand theft auto possession of stolen property and reckless driving. He was sitting in the back of a patrol car, watching his freedom disappear in the rearview mirror, just like he had watched Cynthia fall in the foyer. Back at the lake house, Cynthia was still sitting on the floor. She was bruised. She was alone. She was broke. The silence of the empty house was heavy around her. The man she destroyed her life for was in handcuffs. The company she stole was dead. And I sat in my apartment finishing my sandwich. I took a sip of iced tea. I felt a strange sense of closure. The rat had fled the ship, but he hadn't made it to the shore. The trap was sprung. The debris was falling. And there was only one act left to play. The silence in the lake house after Blake fled was different than the silence before. It was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. For 3 days, Cynthia did not leave the property. She nursed the bruise on her hip where she had fallen, and she drank the cheap wine that was left in the pantry because the good stuff was gone. She was waiting for a miracle. She was waiting for someone to call and say it was all a misunderstanding. But the phone did not ring with good news. It only rang with debt collectors. The first physical blow to her new reality came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a subtle email or a polite letter. It was a sheriff's deputy standing at the front gate. He was not there to arrest her, but he brought something just as devastating. He taped a notice to the iron bars of the gate. It was a notice of foreclosure. When I designed the financial structure of the house, I had leveraged the equity to secure a line of credit for the business. It was a common practice for contractors. But the loan agreement had a very specific clause called a cross-default provision. When the business accounts were frozen due to the license violation and the suspected fraud, the bank automatically called the note on the house. They demanded full repayment of the $5 million mortgage immediately. Cynthia walked down the long driveway in her bathrobe to read the notice. She stood there in the morning mist, reading the words that evicted her from the life she thought she owned. She had 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days before the bank sent a crew to change the locks and put my custom furniture out on the street. She went back inside and tried to call David, her lawyer. David, the man with the cheap suit and the diploma from the school I had never heard of. He answered on the 4th try. His voice was not friendly anymore. It was cold and transactional. She begged him to stop the foreclosure. She told him to file an injunction. She told him to sue the bank. David cut her off. He asked a simple question. He asked if she had received his latest invoice. Cynthia stammered. She said she couldn't access the accounts. She said the bank freeze was a mistake. She promised to pay him double once the liquid assets were released. David laughed. It was a dry sound. He told her that he knew about the lawsuits. He knew about the Sovereign Group demanding $10 million. He knew about the IRS liens that were being filed that very morning. He told her that there were no liquid assets. There was nothing to release. The well was dry. He said, "Cynthia, I am a lawyer, not a charity. You are toxic. Representing you is a liability I cannot afford. Do not call this office again unless you are calling with a credit card number that clears." He hung up. The line went dead, and with it went her last line of defense against the world. Now desperation set in. Real hunger began to gnaw at the edges of her panic. The electricity company sent a final notice. The water company threatened to cut service. She needed cash. She needed to eat. She needed to pay for gas to get to the city to beg for mercy. She went to her closet. It was a room the size of most people's apartments. It was filled with racks of designer clothes, shoes, and handbags. For years, she had collected Hermes Birkin bags like other people collect stamps. She told me they were investments. She said they held their value better than gold. Now she had to test that theory. She loaded the trunk of her Mercedes, which she still had only because the repo man hadn't found it yet, with 6 of her most expensive bags and 3 armfuls of couture dresses. She drove to a high-end consignment shop in Buckhead. She walked in expecting to be treated like the queen she used to be. But the owner of the shop knew who she was. The news of the Prescot scandal was all over the local blogs. The owner looked at the bags. She looked at Cynthia's desperate eyes. She smelled the blood in the water. She offered Cynthia 10 cents on the dollar. Cynthia argued. She cried. She said the crocodile bag alone was worth $50,000. The owner shrugged. She said, "Take it or leave it, honey. You need the money today. I don't need the bags." Cynthia took the deal. She walked out with a check for $15,000. It felt like a fortune in her hand, but deep down she knew it was nothing. It wouldn't pay the mortgage. It wouldn't pay the lawyers. It wouldn't fix the $10 million hole in the hull of her ship. It was just enough to keep the lights on for a few more weeks while she watched the water rise. That night, sitting in the dark living room, illuminated only by the light of the moon, reflecting off the lake, the realization finally hit her. It hit her harder than the floor had when Blake pushed her. She realized that for 40 years she had been protected. She had been safe. Not because she was smart, not because she was special, but because I was there. I was the wall that kept the wind out. I was the roof that kept the rain off. I was the one who handled the permits, the inspections, the taxes, and the problems. She had looked at my silence and mistaken it for weakness. She had looked at my gray hair and mistaken it for obsolescence. She didn't understand that my silence was the hum of a well-oiled machine, keeping her world spinning. She had kicked out the engineer and tried to drive the train herself, and now the train had derailed and she was trapped in the wreckage. She thought about Blake, the man she destroyed her family for. He was sitting in a county jail cell, unable to make bail because his assets were frozen too. He hadn't protected her. He had used her and discarded her the moment the check bounced. She looked at the empty spot on the wall where my photo used to hang. She realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that I was the only person on earth who could save her. I was the only one who held the license. I was the only one who could walk onto those job sites and make the red tape disappear. If I came back, the penalties would stop. The bank might unlock the accounts. The lawsuits might be settled. She needed me, not as a husband, but as a savior. She spent the next 2 days trying to find me. She called my old number, but I had changed it. She went to the motel where I had stayed, but I was gone. She called Mrs. Higgins, who hung up on her with a satisfying click. Finally, she found a piece of paper in the glove compartment of my old truck, which she still had the keys to. It was a receipt from a moving company I had used to transport a few boxes to my new apartment. It had an address on the north side of the city. It was a rainy Tuesday night. A storm had rolled in from the west, turning the sky a bruised purple. Thunder rattled the windows of the empty lake house. Cynthia put on a raincoat. She got into the Mercedes. The gas light was on, but she didn't stop. She drove toward the city. The rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the lights of the highway. She drove with a single-minded focus. She was going to find me. She was going to beg. She was going to use every ounce of history we had to guilt me into saving her. She arrived at my building around 8:00. It was a nice building, modern and secure, but nothing compared to the estate she was losing. She parked on the street because she didn't have a code for the garage. She walked to the front door. She was soaked. Her expensive hair was plastered to her skull. Her makeup was running down her cheeks in black streaks. She looked at the intercom system. She found my name. Prescott. She pressed the button. Up in my apartment, I was making soup. I heard the buzzer. I looked at the monitor. I saw her standing there in the rain, shivering, looking like a drowned cat. She looked old. She looked broken. I didn't buzz her in. I didn't speak. I put on my shoes. I grabbed an umbrella. I walked down the stairs to the lobby. I opened the front door. The wind caught it and ripped it from my hand, slamming it against the wall. Cynthia jumped. She looked up at me. She saw a man in clean clothes. A man who looked rested. A man who stood tall. She didn't see the victim she had created. She saw the husband she had thrown away. She opened her mouth to speak, but her teeth were chattering. She dropped to her knees right there on the wet concrete. The rain soaked into her pants immediately. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my trousers. She sobbed. She said, "Tom, please. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. You have to help me. They are taking everything. Please, Tom, I am your wife." I looked down at her. I felt the cold rain misting on my face. I remembered the courtroom. I remembered her whisper. I remembered her laughing with Blake. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold precision of a structural engineer looking at a building that had been condemned. I stepped back, pulling my pant leg from her grip. I looked her in the eye. I said, "Get up, Cynthia. You are ruining your pants, and you are going to need those pants because you have a long walk ahead of you." She looked up at me confused. She thought I was going to invite her in. She thought I was going to offer her a towel and a check. I did not move aside. I stood in the doorway, blocking the warmth and the light of the lobby. I looked at her with eyes as hard as granite. I prepared to deliver the final lesson. The one that would cost her more than money. The one that would cost her the last shred of hope she was clinging to. I stepped aside and let the door swing open. It was not an invitation born of warmth. It was the calculated move of a man who needed the witness to be present for the final verdict. Cynthia stumbled into the lobby, her wet shoes squeaking against the tile. She looked small. The power she had wielded in the courtroom just 30 days ago had dissolved in the rain, leaving behind a shivering woman in ruined designer clothes. "Come in," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the anger she probably expected. She followed me up the stairs. She was limping slightly, favoring the hip she had injured when Blake pushed her. We walked down the hallway to my unit. I unlocked the door and held it open. The apartment was small. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet complex. It was nothing like the lake house. There were no marble floors. There were no crystal chandeliers. But it was warm. It smelled of the vegetable soup I had simmering on the stove. It smelled of rosemary and thyme and peace. The furniture was simple but comfortable. The floors were clean. The books were organized on the shelves. It was a home. Cynthia stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the welcome mat. She looked around. Her eyes darted from the clean kitchen counter to the comfortable armchair by the window. I could see the confusion in her face. She expected me to be living in squalor. She expected to find me broken. Instead, she found a man who had rebuilt his foundation. I walked to the kitchen and turned off the stove. I reached into the cupboard and pulled out a clean ceramic mug. I poured hot water from the kettle and dropped in a tea bag. I did not ask her what she wanted. I simply placed the mug on the small dining table and pulled out a chair. "Sit," I said. She sat. She wrapped her freezing hands around the hot mug. She was shaking violently. Whether it was from the cold or the terror of her situation, I could not tell. She took a sip of the tea. The steam rose up and clouded her face, masking the ruin of her makeup. Then she started to talk. It began as a whisper and grew into a desperate torrent of words. "Tom," she said, her voice cracking, "you have to help me. I do not know what else to do. The bank took the house. They changed the locks this morning. I have nowhere to go. My cards are declined. My friends won't answer my calls." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "You are the only one who can fix this. You are the qualifying agent. If you come back. If you just sign the papers to reactivate the license, the stop work orders will be lifted. The penalties will stop. The bank will unfreeze the accounts. We can save the company." She reached across the table and tried to take my hand. I moved my hand away, placing it calmly on my knee. She continued, undeterred by my rejection. I will give you half, 50%. We can be partners again, just like the old days. You run the sites. I will handle the office. We can fire the new staff. We can bring Mrs. Higgins back. I will sign whatever you want. 50%, Tom. That is millions of dollars. I watched her. I studied her face. I looked for a single trace of genuine remorse. I looked for an apology that wasn't tied to a financial transaction. I found nothing. She was bargaining. She was trying to buy her life back with money she didn't have, using assets that were already forfeited. When she saw that the offer of money didn't move me, she switched tactics. She went for the emotional jugular. She started talking about Blake. It was him, she sobbed. It was all him. He manipulated me, Tom. He told me you were too old. He told me the company was losing value. He made me do it. I never wanted to hurt you. I was confused. I was vulnerable. She took a long, shuddering breath. He is a monster. He stole my jewelry. He stole the cash from the safe. He pushed me down the stairs, Tom. Look at my bruise. He left me to die. He never loved me. He only loved the money. But I loved you. We were married for 40 years. Doesn't that mean anything? Doesn't our history count for something? You can't just let me be destroyed because of one mistake. I listened to every word. I let her pour the poison out. I let her blame the man she had chosen over me. I let her rewrite history to make herself the victim. It was fascinating in a morbid way. She truly believed that she was innocent. She believed that her greed was actually victimhood. She thought she was getting through to me. She saw me sitting there quietly listening, and she mistook my silence for softening. She thought the hot tea was a peace offering. She thought the warm apartment was a sanctuary I was offering to share. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing black mascara across her cheek. "So you will do it," she said, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "You will come to the licensing board tomorrow. We can tell them it was a clerical error. We can say you never really resigned. We can fix this, Tom. And then we can go get dinner. We can start over." I looked at the woman who had whispered in my ear at the courthouse that she wanted me to die alone. I looked at the woman who had laughed while her lover mocked me. I stood up slowly. I picked up my own mug of tea and took a sip. I walked over to the kitchen counter where I had left my briefcase. I opened it. I pulled out a thick manila folder. It was new. The edges were sharp. I walked back to the table. I did not sit down. I stood over her, casting a long shadow across the table. I placed the folder in front of her. Cynthia looked at it. She looked up at me. She smiled a weak, hopeful smile. "Is this the reinstatement paperwork?" she asked. "Did you already draw it up?" I shook my head. "You are mistaken, Cynthia," I said. My voice was low, steady, and cold as the bottom of the lake. "I did not invite you in here to save you. I did not give you tea because I want to be your partner. I invited you in because there is one last thing you need to see. One last piece of the puzzle that you missed." Her smile faltered. She reached out and touched the folder. I continued. "You spent the last 10 minutes telling me how Blake destroyed the company. You told me he was the villain. You told me you were just a victim of his manipulation. But you signed the papers, Cynthia. You fired Mrs. Higgins. You ordered the cheap steel. You tried to buy a Porsche with hospital funds." I leaned in closer. "You think the problem is that the company has no license. You think the problem is that the sites are shut down. You think if I come back, the money turns back on." I tapped the folder with my index finger. "But you are wrong. The company isn't just paused. It isn't just sleeping. Prescot Construction is dead. It has millions of dollars in debt that it cannot pay. It has lawsuits it cannot win. It is a corpse. Cynthia stared at the folder. Her hands were shaking again. "What is this?" she whispered. I said, "Open it." She opened the folder. Inside there were copies of bank transfer documents. There were letters of assignment from the First National Bank of Georgia. There were purchase agreements for distressed debt. She looked at the papers, but she didn't understand them. She was not a financial expert. She was a consumer. I explained it to her. I used simple words. I said, when the bank froze your accounts, they classified the company loans as toxic assets. They wanted them off their books. They wanted to recoup whatever pennies they could get. They put the debt up for sale. I paused to let her look at the buyer's name on the documents. I bought the debt, Cynthia. I used my retirement funds. I used the money I made from my investments. I bought the mortgage on the office building. I bought the equipment loans. I bought the line of credit. She looked up at me, her mouth falling open in horror. I am not your husband anymore, I said. I am not your partner. And I am certainly not your qualifying agent. I pointed to the signature line on the bottom document. I am your creditor. I own your debt. I own the liens on the equipment. And because you signed that personal guarantee clause in the divorce settlement, I own you. Cynthia dropped the folder. She pushed her chair back, scraping it loudly against the floor. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated fear. She realized then that she hadn't walked into a sanctuary. She had walked into a trap. I picked up the mug of tea she had been drinking. I walked to the sink and poured it out. Now, I said, turning back to her, we need to discuss the terms of your surrender. Because unlike you, I do not leave loose ends. I watched her flip through the pages, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, while her brain refused to accept the reality of what she was seeing. It was a cognitive dissonance so strong it was almost palpable in the small room. She was staring at the assignment of debt documents. She was staring at the transfer of liens with the bank's official seal stamped in blue ink. But she still saw me as Tom, the husband she had discarded and humiliated. She could not reconcile that image with Tom, the man who now effectively owned the mortgage on the building she was sitting in. I leaned back against the kitchen counter and crossed my arms over my chest. I explained it to her slowly, using the same tone I used to use when explaining a complex structural problem to a junior architect. I told her that when the First National Bank froze the accounts, they classified the Prescot construction portfolio as non-performing. To them, it was toxic waste. They were terrified of the liability. They wanted it off their books before the quarter ended. They didn't care about the potential of the company. They only cared about minimizing their risk exposure. I told her that I had made a call to an old friend, a man named Robert, who I had built a vacation home for 20 years ago. He happened to sit on the board of directors for that bank. I told her I offered to buy the distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. I used my retirement savings. I liquidated my personal investment portfolio. I leveraged everything I had left. The bank was happy to salvage anything from the wreckage. They signed over the notes. They signed over the collateral. Cynthia looked up from the papers, her face a shade of gray I had never seen on a living person. She whispered, "So you own the company?" I corrected her instantly. I said, "No, Cynthia. I do not own the company. I own the debt. There is a massive difference. The company is yours. You own the lawsuits from the Sovereign Group. You own the bad reputation. You own the shattered contracts and the angry mob of workers. What I own is the right to collect. I own the mortgage on the headquarters building downtown. I own the liens on every single bulldozer, crane, and truck in the fleet. And most importantly, I own the personal guarantee you signed in the divorce settlement." She dropped the papers. They scattered across the table like dead leaves falling from a dying tree. She realized then that the trap was not just a cage. It was a vice, and I was tightening the screw with every word. I walked around the table and stood next to her. I placed a single fresh sheet of paper on top of the messy pile. It was a quitclaim deed and a general release of liability. I said, "You have a choice, Cynthia. It is a very simple choice, but it is the last one you will ever make as a wealthy woman. Option A is the hard way. I pick up the phone right now and I call the district attorney. I show him the digital trail of the $500,000 you tried to wire to the Porsche dealership. That money was held in a designated trust account for the hospital project. Moving it for personal use is a felony. It is called theft by conversion. With the amount involved being $500,000, you are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence. You will spend the next 10 to 20 years in a state penitentiary." She made a choking sound. She grabbed her throat as if she couldn't breathe. The reality of prison was suddenly very real to her. The orange jumpsuit, the metal bars, the loss of every comfort she had ever known. I continued, my voice relentless. "Option B is the easy way. You sign this paper. You transfer all remaining assets to me to satisfy the debt. That includes the title to the office building. That includes the land at the lake house, which the bank hasn't foreclosed on yet, because I bought that note too before they could auction it. You sign over everything. The cars that haven't been repossessed. The jewelry you have left. The furniture. Everything." She looked at the paper. She looked at me. She asked in a trembling voice, "So I leave with nothing?" I nodded. I said, "You leave with exactly what you brought to this marriage 40 years ago. Nothing. But you leave with your freedom. You walk out that door and you never look back. I will absorb the debt. I will deal with the lawsuits. I will handle the mess you created. But you disappear. You leave Atlanta. You start over somewhere else." She started to cry again. It was a pathetic sound, a whimper of total defeat. She said, "But I am 48 years old, Tom. I can't start over. I have no skills. I have no resume. I gave you the best years of my life." I felt a flash of cold anger. It burned hotter than the tea. I leaned down so my face was inches from hers. I said, "You didn't give me anything, Cynthia. We built a life together and you sold it for a younger man and a sports car. You gambled and you lost. Do not talk to me about wasted years. I am 70 years old and I am starting over because of you. The difference is I have my integrity. You have nothing but the consequences of your own greed." I put a pen on the table. It was a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. It wasn't the gold fountain pen I used to sign the divorce papers. It was just a disposable piece of plastic. I said, "Decide. Right now. If you walk out that door without signing, I make the call." She looked at the pen. She looked at the door. She looked at the life she thought she was going to have. The luxury, the power, the young lover. It was all smoke. It was all gone. All that was left was a choice between a cell and the street. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold it. She pressed the tip to the paper. She hesitated for 1 second, looking up at me one last time, hoping for a reprieve, hoping for the husband who used to forgive her everything. She searched my eyes for any trace of the man who had built her a castle on the lake. She found only a creditor. She signed. She signed the deed. She signed the release. She signed away the last remnants of the empire she thought she had conquered. She signed away her future to pay for her past. I took the paper. I checked the signature. It was shaky but legible. It would hold up in court. I put it in my folder and closed it. I said, "Get out." She stood up. She swayed on her feet. She looked around the small apartment as if she didn't know where she was. She looked at her wet clothes. She looked at her empty hands. She realized she was leaving with less than she came in with, because now she didn't even have hope. She walked to the door. She opened it. The hallway was dark and quiet. She stepped out. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. She just disappeared into the shadows of the stairwell. I closed the door. I locked it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. I took a deep breath. It was over. Cynthia was gone. She was walking out into the rain, with no money, no home, no car, and no friends. She was back to zero. Actually, she was below zero. She was a middle-aged woman with a ruined reputation in a town that forgives everything except failure. She would have to find a job. She would have to rent a room. She would have to live the life she had tried so hard to escape. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the folder containing the debt and the deeds. I held in my hands the wreckage of Prescot Construction. It was a mess. It was a disaster. There were millions of dollars in liabilities. There were angry clients. There were broken contracts. But it was my disaster. I sat down at the table. I opened the folder again. I looked at the list of assets, the building, the equipment, the land. It was all there. It was battered and bruised, but the bones were still good. The foundation was still there. I am a builder. That is what I do. I take broken things and I fix them. I take raw materials and I make them stand up. I take chaos and I turn it into structure. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I took the cheap pen Cynthia had used. I wrote a single word at the top of the page. Phoenix. It was time to rebuild. Not for her, not for the legacy of the past, but for the future. For the crew that needed jobs, for the buildings that needed to be finished, for Mrs. Higgins who needed her pension secured. For myself. I looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The streetlights were reflecting on the wet pavement, creating a path of light in the darkness. I felt tired. My bones ached. I was 70 years old, and I had just fought the hardest battle of my life. But as I looked at the word Phoenix written on the paper, I felt something else. I felt a spark, a small, warm light in the center of my chest. It was the feeling of a new foundation being poured. It was the feeling of beginning. I turned off the kitchen light and walked to my bedroom. I was going to sleep well tonight. Tomorrow I had work to do. 3 months is a long time in the construction business. In 3 months, you can pour a foundation, erect a steel skeleton, and enclose a building against the elements. You can also take a ruined reputation and a bankrupt company and turn them into something new, something stronger. I stood on the sidewalk in downtown Atlanta, looking up at the office building that I used to own. The old sign that said Prescot Construction was gone. It had been taken down by a crew 2 weeks ago. In its place was a new sign. It was simple, modern, and clean. It read, Phoenix Builders. I liked the name. It felt right. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to burn everything down before you can rise from the ashes. I walked through the revolving doors. The security guard, a man named Sam, who had been there for 10 years, tipped his hat to me. He smiled. It was a genuine smile, not the fearful look he used to give Blake. I took the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, the first thing I heard was the sound of typing. It was a rhythmic, steady sound, like rain on a tin roof. Mrs. Higgins was sitting at her desk. She was wearing a new cardigan, and her hair was perfectly set. When she saw me, she stood up and smoothed her skirt. She didn't cry this time. She just beamed. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott," she said. "The coffee is ready, just the way you like it." I thanked her. I walked into my office. It was different now. I had removed the leather furniture Blake had bought. I had ripped out the pretentious curtains Cynthia had installed. I brought back my old drafting table. I brought back the smell of blueprints and honest work. Sitting across from my desk was Mike Donovan, my chief engineer. He had come back the day I announced the new company. So had Sarah, the logistics head. So had Jerry, the site superintendent. They had all returned. Not because I offered them more money, but because they knew that with me, the checks would clear and the buildings would stand. Mike stood up and shook my hand. He said the inspectors just left the Midtown Tower site, Tom. They signed off on the structural integrity. We are green for concrete. I nodded. It was good news. The moment I had reactivated my qualifying agent license and attached it to the new entity, Phoenix Builders, the red tape had dissolved. The stop work orders were lifted. The police cruisers left the gates. The silence of the job sites was replaced by the roar of machinery. We negotiated with the Sovereign Group. When they realized I was back in charge and that I had absorbed the debt, they dropped the lawsuit. They knew that I was the only man in Georgia who could finish their tower on time. They reinstated the contract. The bank was happier too. They had swapped a toxic, non-performing loan for a secured debt held by a man with a perfect credit score and 50 years of experience. They unlocked the lines of credit. The money was flowing again. But this time it was flowing into materials and payroll, not into sports cars and jewelry. I spent the morning reviewing the schedules. We were behind, but we could catch up. The crew was motivated. They were working double shifts voluntarily because they were just happy to have their jobs back. At lunch, I drove out to the lake. I didn't go there to fish. I went there to sign the final papers for the sale of the house. I had sold the estate to a young tech entrepreneur from California. He paid $4.2 million for it. It was less than it was worth, but I didn't care. I just wanted it gone. I wanted the memories of Cynthia's parties and Blake's arrogance to be erased from my ledger. I took the check from the closing attorney. I didn't put it in my personal account. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't buy a new truck. I drove straight to the bank and opened a trust account. I named it the Edward Prescott Memorial Scholarship Fund after my father. The interest from that $4 million would pay for the college education of children of construction workers who had been injured or killed on the job. It would send welders and carpenters to trade school. It would build futures. That was my legacy. Not the house, not the cars, but the opportunity I could give to someone else. On my way back to the city, I decided to stop for groceries. I didn't go to the high-end organic market Cynthia used to drag me to. I went to a discount superstore on the south side of town. I needed bread milk and maybe a steak for dinner. I pushed my cart through the aisles. The store was crowded and loud. I picked up my items and headed to the checkout lanes. That was when I saw her. She was working at lane 4. She was wearing a blue vest that was too big for her. Her hair, which used to be perfectly colored and styled, was pulled back in a messy bun showing gray roots. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her face looked tired, lined with the stress of survival. It was Cynthia. She was scanning a bag of dog food for a customer who was yelling at her about a coupon. She looked small. She looked defeated. Her hands, the hands that used to wear diamond rings, were bare and chapped. I stood there in the middle of the aisle, frozen for a moment. I watched her. I remembered the woman she used to be. I remembered the woman who wanted to travel the world. I remembered the woman who betrayed me. I thought I would feel anger. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph. I thought I would want to walk through her line just to make her look at me, just to make her see the man she threw away. But I didn't feel any of those things. I felt nothing. She was just a stranger. She was just a cashier scanning items in a vest that didn't fit. The hate had evaporated, leaving behind only a dull indifference. She looked up then. Her eyes scanned the crowd. For a second, our gazes met across the rows of candy bars and magazines. I saw her eyes widen. I saw the flash of recognition. I saw the shame flood her face, turning her cheeks red. She looked down quickly, fumbling with the scanner, terrified that I would approach her, terrified that I would say something. I didn't. I turned my cart around. I walked to lane 12 at the other end of the store. I paid for my groceries. I walked out into the parking lot. The sun was setting, turning the sky a brilliant gold. I walked to my 1995 Ford F-150. It was still dented. The paint was still peeling. But the engine started on the first turn. It was reliable. It was strong. I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't look back at the store. I didn't look back at Cynthia. She was in my rearview mirror physically and metaphorically. I rolled down the window and let the wind hit my face. I thought about the future. I thought about the buildings I still had to build. I thought about the soup I was going to make for dinner. People think revenge is about making the other person scream. They think it is about destruction. But I realized as I drove down the highway that they are wrong. The best revenge isn't fire. It isn't noise. It isn't violence. The best revenge is peace. It is waking up in a bed that belongs to you. It is doing work that matters. It is living a life so full and so complete that the people who tried to destroy you become nothing more than footnotes in your history. Cynthia had wanted everything. She ended up with nothing. I had been left with nothing. And now I had everything that mattered. I turned on the radio. There was an old country song playing. I hummed along as I drove toward the city, toward my home, toward my life. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I wanted to be. Many people believe that revenge is a dish best served cold, filled with destruction and noise. But standing here today, I realized they are wrong. The greatest revenge isn't about watching your enemies suffer. It's about watching yourself thrive. It is the peace of a quiet home, the satisfaction of honest work, and the freedom of a clear conscience. Cynthia chased the illusion of having everything and ended up with nothing. I was stripped down to zero, yet I found everything that truly matters. If you are facing a storm, remember greed destroys, but integrity rebuilds. Your character is the one foundation no one can ever take away. If this story of justice and rebuilding resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps share these stories with others who might need hope. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch? I read every single comment. Until next time, keep building.